Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Helen Jung. I'm the opinion editor with the Oregonian, and I'm here talking with people from the Yes for Our Libraries campaign, which is measure 26-211. I'd like to start off by just handing it over to you to talk a little bit about what this measure would do and why you think voters should support it.
Sure, I'd love to get started. I'm Bailey Elke. I'm Director of Libraries. Thank you for having us here, Helen. I'm joined by my colleague, Aline Davis, who is a facilities manager for the library and has been very involved in this project. I just need to say right up front that as library employees, Aline and I are prohibited from doing any sort of advocacy around this. So we're just here to provide factual or technical information about the proposed projects and the library as needed. So I will provide a little background. So I don't know if you're aware, but the Multnomah County Library is one of the busiest library systems in the country. Most recently, it was fourth busiest in terms of circulation. That's the entire country, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and 102nd in terms of its physical footprint. And in fact, something worth sharing is that you could total up the square footage of every single one of the library's buildings, not just the public spaces, the branches, but also the administrative and operation spaces. And that would all fit inside Seattle's main library with room to spare. So these small spaces have created an ongoing challenge in terms of services, especially as our population in Multnomah County has continued to increase. Our square footage per capita has remained essentially static over the last several decades while the population continues to grow. It's been since the 90s since the library took a significant look at system-wide updates, and even that process didn't add a lot of square footage to the overall space. So this particular process started in 2016. We spent a year studying the current state, listening and learning from the community. It included a robust community engagement effort that involved people from various community nonprofits, K-12 and higher ed institutions, neighborhood associations, and elected officials. We also conducted formal and informal surveys and conversations and reached out to 13 community-based organizations that focus on communities of color. We really wanted to hear from people who we don't necessarily always hear from. And what we heard from all of that community input was that they love their libraries, but that they're way too small. And there was definitely a pronounced concern about the lack of library space in East County. So all of that work over the course of that year resulted in a capital master plan for the whole system that spans about 20 years. And that master plan is called the Framework for Future Library Spaces. And it can be found on the library's website. So with those recommendations from that master plan in hand, we spent the next 2 or so years further engaging the community, including a blue ribbon committee of community members, and crafting a proposal based on all of that information, which is what you are seeing before you today for the board's consideration. So that proposal prioritizes the smallest, most heavily used branches in communities with the greatest need. It also addresses that space deficit in East County, where now 40% of the county's population lives, and the library only has 20% of its square footage. And it also looked at creating operational efficiencies to keep down operations costs over time, and as well as balancing projects across the county, since we're a countywide system. I want to talk a little bit about one of the most critical projects, because I think it's something that some folks, the average person, may not understand how impactful it can be for library operations, and that is the centralized materials handling site, where we would add automated materials handling equipment to streamline the whole process of sorting and distributing physical materials across the system. The library moves around 52,000 items around the system, every week. And on average, in our current very manual process, when you place a book on hold from home, by the time it reaches your local branch library, it's been touched around 8 times by library staff. So it's currently a very manual process. And in fact, this whole notion of an automated materials handling system is very common. And in fact, we're sort of late to the game. Libraries around us, like Beaverton and Oregon City, already have these systems in place. So it's nothing terribly unique or novel. And then the other two categories of projects besides that sorting center address the space and equity in East County with that new flagship library that will be similar in size to the Central Library in downtown Portland, but will be really significantly different kinds of space. It will be a new library specifically designed to 21st century needs. And then also another sort of category is addressing the needs of those busiest and smallest branches. I think a great example of the challenges the library are facing in terms of space is the Belmont Library, which is our busiest branch. There are more holds picked up at that tiny little 6,000 square foot library than at the Central Library downtown. And that is a neighborhood, a community that continues to grow and evolve, but the space in that building simply hasn't kept up with the kind of demand and the needs that it has. And many of our buildings were built, in the early 20th century or even earlier, and have never been expanded in terms of footprint. They've been renovated and updated, but that expansion simply hasn't happened. So this proposal, this group of projects, we think addresses those needs appropriately, and we're happy to answer any questions that come up over the course of this conversation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you lay out a little bit about just what it's asking of property owners? The rate, for instance.
Yeah, you mean the rate? Yeah. So for the median home assessed value, which is about $200,000 right now, it would be 61 cents per $1,000 of assessed value. And for a $200,000, and that's, mind you, that's assessed, that's not real market value, house, that would come out to about $120 a year, a little over $10 a month.
Okay.
And then half of the households would be less than that, and half of the households would be more than that.
Okay, great, thank you. So one question I have is, why now? There's many money measures on the November ballot. We're in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with the economy. Why is it important for voters to say now? Why can't this wait until a year from now?
Yeah, and I'm going to ask Rochelle. Yeah, thank you, to respond to that, or Ruth.
Sure, I'll jump in and help address that, Helen. I'm Ruth Shelley. I'm Executive Director of Portland Children's Museum, and I was honored to be a member of the library's Blue Ribbon Committee. This bond is a great value, a small price for major impact and multiple beneficiaries. And as part of the Blue Ribbon Committee, we took a hard look at the plan and at its accountability and especially its urgency. We learned how there's, as Bailey explained, there's not enough library to go around for everyone who needs it, especially now. Our libraries are packed and crowded with people. What once was uncomfortable is now unsafe. And librarians regularly have to turn children and families away from story time, for example. They have to turn away job seekers from resume classes. And these tiny aging facilities are so small. The North Portland and St. John branches were built in 1913 before James Joyce published Ulysses. And so they're just really old and compact in an uncomfortable way. But despite this small size, our library system is one of our county's most treasured institutions. As Bailey said, it has not kept up. Our county, our population has grown 30% since the 1990 upgrades that Bailey mentioned, and we're projecting 130,000 more residents in the next 15 years, which is why it's so urgent. We are already behind in terms of the modern upgrades, the increase to high quality internet. way past time to upgrade the branches and the infrastructure of our library.
Yeah, and I'm Rochelle Luther, and I am a trustee on the Library Foundation and a business community member. I would just add that, you know, it's been over 30 years since there's been a significant capital investment in one of the most treasured assets of this community. And at a time when we know that our students are going to be significantly behind based on the impacts of the reliance on the library as a critical piece of infrastructure to help bridge that gap and to catch up, the reliance on the internet, the upgrades in all the libraries for that free access as one of the biggest providers of free internet in the state. It's a very significant resource for our children to be able to catch up from what is, I think, in anybody, it's understanding a significant setback that the pandemic has handed all of us. So I think it's time. We've waited for over 30 years to evolve our library system, and really, we also, as responsible stewards of the tax dollars we do have, I think what Bailey described is a system that needs to be upgraded in order to be more efficient and more responsible with the tax dollars that we do have.
I imagine that the way that people are using the library is changing over time with technology, reliance on ebooks, et cetera. Can you talk about ways that this bond sort of helps prepare libraries to be libraries of the future, as opposed to kind of just the same model that we've seen?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. Of course, a key element is increasing the speed and efficacy of the internet across all of the branches. We have people coming to library parking lots right now in order to find a hotspot, and the digital divide has become so pronounced during the pandemic, and it will only grow worse into the future, which is why we have to really focus on this aspect of it. But I'd like to emphasize that the high quality internet, which is part of the bond and that would be implemented immediately, is only part of the picture, because access has to come with help in using computers, in navigating the internet, in applying for jobs. And that's why the librarians are so important in terms of the relationship between the librarian and the patron. Having internet access is one thing. Knowing how to use it is something completely different. And what Bailey pointed out in terms of every book being touched 8 times before it gets to your branch when it's on hold, with the automated system, those touches will be from people to people. We can redeploy library staff from touching books to touching people in this very close relationship and helping them on with their lives.
And I think I would just add that it's really important, if we've been taught anything about the circumstance and the importance of technology, we also understand that community is equally vital for development of children in particular. And those spaces are really vital in bringing together community, in allowing for reading books and learning together. Even some of the maker spaces that you see in providing more modern ways in addressing how children learn, those are all spaces that bring humans and communities together. And we right now have to turn people away, turn parents away, where they may not be comfortable reading to their children at home, but be able to access the services of their librarians in that space. Important that we build a footprint to be able to accommodate the community in those ways. And right now we're just turning away too many people based on just physical restrictions.
So
those foundational early years in learning and loving to read are so important for success in education later on.
So will this solve the capacity issues for some of those classes or story times?
Go ahead.
I can give some factual information that might contribute to that question, Helen. The library currently has only 2 rooms that have a capacity of 100 people. And we have only have 8 individual, private, quiet study spaces across the system where people can come and know that they'll be able to focus and concentrate, do a Skype interview, while all sorts of other busyness is happening in the rest of the library. So the new spaces that libraries around the country, in fact, the Oregon City Library, the new Oregon City Library, the Hillsborough Library are good demonstrations of what a 21st century library looks like. And it is a lot. It's not just about stacks of books. Books will still be a very important part of these spaces, but it's also about the kinds of spaces that Rochelle and Ruth were just describing, where people can come and learn on their own terms or engage in community on their own terms, whether that's by themselves in a quiet study space while there's a busy story time happening out in the middle of the library, or it's a large meeting space where people can take a class on job skills and filling out resumes, or get help with their taxes, all of those sorts of things. And those kinds of service require different kinds of spaces. And we're seeing libraries all over the country design those kinds of spaces that we simply don't have in our current structure.
And I would just add that, as Bailey noted, there is a longer term plan. So this, and we're looking at that first element of that plan. So there may be some branches that aren't touched by this plan that may need some adjustments in the future, but that's not on the table today.
I'd be quick to add that these decisions of prioritization have been done through the lens of equity, and to really analyze which parts of the population need an increase in capacity the most. And so if you look at 40% of our population being in East County, but East County having only 20% of the current library resources, that's why there is an emphasis in East County, and 7 branches that will be substantially upgraded because they have been prioritized as the oldest or the smallest. But I'm quick to point out that every single library will get an increase in internet service, and so everyone will be touched with some upgrade, as a rising tide raises all ships.
And does the library have the resources now to, or does it expect to have the resources to operate the new East County Library as well as additional, these expanded spaces?
Yeah, one thing I want to note on that in terms of, and I'll let Bailey talk to some of the factual pieces about the staffing, but as we think about the efficiencies that are expected to be gained both from the operating center, but also frankly just design of library spaces in being able to have line of sight to a broader scope of the building, meaning that can reduce the staffing requirements within the buildings themselves. So one of the great things about this proposal from an just purely investment perspective is that you're really gaining a lot of efficiencies in this investment, creating that value, freeing up those important and valuable resources for the kinds of value-added services that our really valued librarians provide to the community. So I'll turn over to Bailey for kind of specific staffing comments.
Yeah, and I may bring in my colleague Aline as well, but I would definitely repeat what Rochelle just said, and then say that as part of that due diligence that we undertook over the last couple of years, we definitely looked at ongoing operations costs and how they might be impacted by an expansion of space. I think one of the important things to remember about all of this is that it's not a, I don't know what the right description is, but doubling the size of the footprint doesn't mean a doubling of the staff, because the spaces are going to be markedly different. And a lot of those spaces, as I described earlier, would be private study rooms or community rooms. And those spaces aren't necessarily staffed unless the staff are leading, which they often do, a class or a story time or something like that. So there's that piece of it. And then the efficiencies to be gained with a centralized sorting center. And we've also been looking for some time now at how we staff libraries going forward in the 21st century environment. Staff have been very involved in those considerations. And I think when we did the analysis on the operations costs, I asked for a memo, and that's available on the library's website as well, that projects that our operations and facilities costs, once all of this is complete, would increase by about 5%, which is an amount that we can accommodate within the library's anticipated budgets going forward.
Great, thank you. I think that's pretty much all the questions that I have. Is there anything I haven't asked that you want to address, or anything else you want to emphasize?
I think as the Library campaign, we think this is the best value on the ballot, and really we're seeking your endorsement. And so really hope that we are able to answer all of your questions.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful. We will probably be issuing our endorsement this coming Wednesday on local measures. And if I have any questions, I will follow up probably with Rachel, actually. But thank you again for all your time. This was really helpful.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Sounds good.
Thanks so much, Helen.